Awesome. Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's session, which is the final presentation for Research Impact Week. We are so glad to have you here for today's workshop, Beyond the Manuscript, Effective Data Sharing for Boosting Research Impact. And our presenter today is Isaac Wink. During the presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the chat or unmute yourself. And just as a quick reminder, we have been hosting these sessions all week long. So if you missed a session, we've been recording them, and these recordings will soon be available on the Research Workshop Series past recordings page. And also these recordings will be sent out afterwards to those who registered. And we will be recording today's presentation as well. And then finally, we're going to be sharing a short survey link at the end of today's session. So please take a moment to fill that out, as that will help us improve our future programming for you all. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Isaac.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Annabelle. My name is Isaac Wink. Hello, everyone. I'm the Research Data Librarian for UK Libraries. And for today's session, I'm going to be focusing on data sharing or data publishing, and specifically its role of producing data sets as first-class research outputs that can contribute to your scholarly record as a scientist or as a researcher, play a role in your development that way. Thinking both about some of the mechanics behind how that data publishing happens, and then some of the tactics for making sure that you share and publish your data in a way that other people are able to actually want to access it, work with it, and use it in the future. I'm putting in the chat a link for the slides for today's session where you can view and follow along. That will also be included in the email that goes out after this session, so you can have a record of those long term. And Annabelle will also be sharing some key links in the chat as well, if you'd like to follow along and click on anything that way as we go through. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat, and I'll get to those when the time is right. Otherwise, there will be plenty of time for questions left over at the end of today's session as well. So for the session, we're going to start by defining data publishing or data sharing, and talking about some of the mechanisms behind how it's done. We'll discuss what some of the usage metrics look like for quantifying the impact or reach of published data sets. And then I'll share some tips on how you can boost reuse of data that you've shared or published. Talk about some considerations that you should take into account when you're planning on how to publish your data. How you can use some of the metrics and other information you're able to gather when you put your data out there to report on that impact. And then finally, I'll close with some thoughts on thinking about how you can promote data publication and sharing within your discipline. So just by way of introduction, I did want to mention some of the other services that I offer out of UK Libraries. Obviously, today's session is going to focus on data sharing and publishing, so kind of the end of the research data lifecycle. But I also provide services, consultations, assistance on getting oriented with any other aspects of the research data lifecycle as well. So that can include data management planning, maybe both in a formal sense, if you, for example, are preparing a data management and sharing plan for a federal funder, I can assist you in working on and writing that plan. But it can also be more informal data management planning as well, just having a conversation or thinking about what tools you might want to use during your research process, what contingencies you should take into account, that kind of information that it's good to have upfront in that process. Then I also provide assistance with thinking through management of active data as well in the middle of the research process. I'll share some tips there today on thinking about data documentation and research workflows that can help you avoid some headaches in the middle of that research process, but I can also help connect you to other sources of information or resources at UK, for example, resources for being able to host large amounts of data if you're working with big data. And then, as we'll be focusing on today, I can also help you out on the back end of that process as well, thinking about what happens to your data long term, how will it be preserved, archived, where will it be shared, and how can you really get the biggest impact out of that data. So I wanted to start with a little bit of table setting of just giving a definition of what we're talking about today when we talk about data publishing. So this data publishing is closely related to data sharing, which is a term that you might have heard if you've applied for a federal grant recently. It's data sharing is also a requirement for publication in a large number of journals as well. So data publishing is closely related to that. And I think of it as having three main components for a data set to be considered published. First, that data should be made broadly available to others. That might mean the public at large. So maybe it's hosted online somewhere where anyone can have access to that data. But it might mean a more limited or specific research community if there are any concerns around the wide range accessibility of that data. For example, if it contains data that's sensitive in any way or there are privacy concerns with it. Um, in addition, published data should be available at a stable location, typically on the web, typically in a data repository, as opposed to, for example, hosting it on a personal research website or at a URL that might change or get degraded over time and no longer be accessible in that same way that it was previously. And finally, a published data set shouldn't require the personal intervention of the research team in order to be able to facilitate access. So you may have seen in data availability statements for articles that you've read, authors often put that their data will be made available to other researchers upon a request to the authors. That is not something that we would consider published or even shared data because that data is not easily accessible to others. Oftentimes, researchers if they change institutions, may not be accessible at that same contact information as what they originally listed. The data set may have changed hands, or there may be someone else who's in charge of stewarding it now. So that data, if it's not made available at a stable location, can often be lost, or there might be issues with others going and trying to retrieve that information. So those are the three components that I think of when it comes to data publishing: making your data set broadly available, doing so at a stable location, and making sure that whenever possible, it doesn't require your intervention for others to be able to download and get access to that data set. An important distinction here when we talk about data publishing as opposed to perhaps article or manuscript publishing is that in most cases, published data sets are not peer reviewed. I'll go through some methods today for where you can host your own data to make it publicly available online. And while there may be some aspect of human review that goes on there to make sure that the data is of a certain quality, it is often not by domain experts who apply the same stamp of peer review that they would to a research article, for example. So that being said, those published data sets do exist as part of the research ecosystem. They can be cited by other authors. They can be cited by you if you are also publishing a peer-reviewed publication that does make use of that data set. And there are some options within some disciplines that we'll talk about if you are interested in what a peer-reviewed data set would look like. But I mention that just because when considering sort of research impact broadly, and metrics that you might need for career advancement, data sets typically would not be considered a peer-reviewed publication in the same way. So what are the motivations for publishing your data? One of the most common and one that you may have experienced previously is a funder requiring data sharing in some capacity. So federal funders like the NIH and the NSF, as well as private nonprofit funders like the American Heart Association, now very commonly require applicants for grants to describe how their data will be made available to others through data sharing. A lot of the processes that we'll talk about here today would also satisfy the requirements of those funders. But outside of that compliance perspective, data sharing and data publishing can also help to boost the credibility of your research. So oftentimes you will be making not only the underlying data set available, but maybe code or programming scripts as well that you use to, for example, generate figures in your publication or otherwise apply analysis to that data set. By including both that raw data as well as your analysis, you're giving other researchers who are reviewing your findings a clear step-by-step path explaining how you got from the data that you generated to the research findings that you ended up publishing. And that can really help to show that you've done your due diligence in the scientific process and can help clear up any confusion or head off any questions about how you conducted that analysis. And finally, you might want to publish your data simply because you want others to be able to use it and cite you so that you can get credit for it as well. So one way data can be valuable is because it allows for reproducibility of results that you've already published. But a lot of the really exciting opportunities for data publication exist in the recombination or reuse of data sets in creative ways in the future. So if you can get into the habit of releasing your data along with any associated research publications that you come out with, then you're making a lot more material available for others to be able to use and build on. And if they do reuse that data, perhaps apply a new mode of analysis to it, then that is something that you would then be able to get citation credit for on that data set. And it would be a demonstration of the fact that your data is contributing to the scientific community beyond just an individual publication that you used it for. So when we think about how data gets published, the best practice for doing so is to make use of an established data repository. A data repository is a home for data sets, sometimes produced from an individual discipline or produced using an individual methodology. You'll see, for example, genomics databases for genomics researchers. But you also see more generalist data repositories as well, which serve as a home and provide a consistent set of metrics for data sets produced across a variety of disciplines. I like to contrast thinking about data repositories from thinking about maybe an individual research website or website for your lab, for example. Well, that kind of research website can give you more control over how your data set maybe is shown to others, and it might be easier for you to be able to use and access kind of on a daily basis. When we think about the long-term accessibility of that data set, if something changes in the URL to your project website, if you are no longer hosting that domain, then it's easy to lose access to it. And it can also be more difficult for journals and others that use set metadata schemes for research outputs to be able to track usage of that data set in the same way. So some key advantages of utilizing a data repository include the fact that data repositories have dedicated teams that will take on the responsibility of maintaining technical infrastructure to make sure that your data remains available in perpetuity. So for example, if you are using a personal website, then you would be responsible for making sure that any plugins used on that website get updated. You'd be responsible for any security concerns associated with it as well. But utilizing a data repository allows you to outsource some of that work to a team that's more specialized in being able to handle some of those issues. Additionally, repositories will make it easier for others to be able to discover and cite your data set in the future. One of the biggest ways that they do this is by assigning data sets a persistent identifier. If you're familiar with the digital object identifier as a way to refer to a journal article, those DOIs can be applied to data sets as well. And that makes sure that there's a persistent link that others are able to use to access that data set, even if it did even if the specific URL to access it did change. Additionally, a lot of repositories, including some of the ones we'll show today, allow you to make use of structured metadata for things like author information, but also subject keywords as well. And those will make it easier for others to be able to discover your data set by searching for data sets, for example, produced by a specific researcher, or searching for them by certain keyword terms. And then finally, many of these repositories also host data sets in a searchable catalog so that others are able to find them through that keyword searching. Although in many cases, having that DOI really is one of the most important aspects for data set discoverability, since many researchers in practice locate data sets by seeing them mentioned or cited in a research article. And then finally, a lot of repositories will provide usage metrics to be able to track engagement with your data in a variety of different forms. And that can be useful for if you ever want to be able to report on how valuable your data set has been to your particular scientific community. Those usage metrics are one way to track that impact, although not the only one, as we'll get into. I wanted to take a moment to just highlight some of the popular published data sets that have been produced by other UK researchers and I picked these to kind of give a sense of what types of data sets can kind of go viral in a sense or become popular with others, and also just to showcase the disciplinary diversity of what types of data sets can be shared. So this first data set hosted on the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Science Research, ICPSR, was published in 2013 as a collection of state legislative election returns between 1967 and 2010. So as you can imagine, this is a data set that has proven to be very valuable to any political science researchers who are doing any kind of research involving state legislative races or campaigns. ICPSR is one of those repositories that includes metrics for how that data set gets used. So this data set has been downloaded more than 500 times just in the past 3 years and has been a source in more than 84 different publications. So it really has been in pretty wide use within this community by the standards of a lot of data sets. So thinking of a data set like that, where it's kind of the researchers did a lot of the legwork of consolidating public information and making it available to other researchers in a single source, that can be one way of creating a high impact data set. Another one is an example that comes from a repository we'll look at in a little bit, known as Dryad, a trait-based framework for predicting foodborne pathogen risk from wild birds. So this one I haven't looked at in as much detail, but you can see that it's been downloaded a number of times and it's also been cited rather widely. This is another trend that I've seen in data sets that kind of purport to provide some sort of framework or methodology for conducting machine learning based predictions or otherwise providing a framework for analyzing other newly collected data. So hosting and framing your data in those terms can also be useful for having it be used by others because there's a direct way in which it can be applicable to research being conducted elsewhere. We've collected this new data and now we're comparing it to this previous framework or benchmark that's been created by another researcher. And then finally, you will often see data sets that are specifically in support of a single article, typically identifiable by a title that starts with data from : so in this case, data from history, geography, and host use shape genome-wide patterns of genetic variation in the red-headed pine sawfly. And I'm not even going to try pronouncing the official species name there. But a data set like this, just based on the name alone, you can see it looks to be more specific to an individual research project that was conducted. We can see that it has one citation, so it looks like this one hasn't necessarily been in wide use by other researchers who are publishing results, but it has been downloaded frequently and it does have quite a number of views. And so we can kind of only speculate as to what the case was for this particular data set, but a number of instructors will often use data sets like this that are hosted on data repositories and used in real research as teaching tools, for example, and have students work with them for their own analysis. So even if you have what might feel like something of a narrowly applicable data set to only your own research, sometimes these data sets do still get kind of a second life in something such as a teaching or instruction tool, or sort of just build traction and gain popularity for other reasons as well. So that's kind of the rosy case for data publishing and how it's something that can allow your data sets to be a first-class research output that really get a lot of traction and gain popularity in a way that you can measure and see from others. But now I am going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers to data publishing and some of the things that kind of prevent data sets from being seen as those research outputs on par with journal articles or other manuscript-based publications. One of the biggest issues there historically has been the fact that it's been quite difficult for there to be objective comparisons of metrics across different data repositories to measure things like the impact of a data set. So for example, a lot of those metrics that we saw previously, things like views or downloads, aren't necessarily objective measurements in the way that we think of them. So for example, does a page view need to be provably viewed by a human? Do we count one person going and refreshing that page multiple times as multiple different views, or are they distinct ones? Or do they all count as one? I'm sorry. Those standards haven't necessarily existed for the full life of some of these data repositories. Fortunately, there has been some development in this area through what's known as the Counter Code of Practice for Research Data, which is a protocol for standardizing some of those infrastructure elements for data sets, but also some of the reporting mechanisms as well for metrics. And that code of practice has been incorporated by DataCite, one of the largest producers of digital object identifiers for data sets across a number of different repositories. And what that means is that a lot of these repositories do now, in fact, have some of these common standards that allow for these standard comparisons. So you could, for example, view the number of downloads or views on a Dryad data set in the same context as you could another repository such as Zenodo. The most common metrics that get used there are views, downloads, and citations, but there are some additional issues with citations in particular as well. Those challenges for citations are twofold. The first of those is that a number of repositories purport to automatically harvest citations of a data set for authors and automatically link those onto the data set so that authors themselves don't need to do any work for putting out alerts or notifications to see if their data set is getting cited. Unfortunately, due in part just to practices around how authors are citing data sets, sometimes that automatic detection gets missed because authors are not citing the data set in the same way that they would a journal publication, for example. In some cases, they're just mentioning it in the text or maybe including a link in the text, but not actually including that in citation information, which means that systems that go through and harvest those citations are not necessarily able to find, index, and count those citations to other articles. One way in which some researchers are trying to address this is through the development of new machine learning tools that would detect dataset citations in the text of an article and then try matching those to a data set that is hosted on one of these data repositories. So that can be a useful option for being able to ameliorate some of that. But part of this is also just a cultural issue as well, and informing researchers, making sure that they understand that data sets should be cited in a similar fashion to other publications as well. Another thornier issue that is still being worked out, and there aren't as evident solutions for, is the idea of pass-through citations for data sets that get adapted. And the best way to think through this is kind of as an example. If I am a researcher and I publish a data set A, and make it available for others to reuse, remix, do other things with, and then another person maybe incorporates that data set into a larger data set, call it data set B, and then publishes that themselves. That original researcher hopefully has cited my data set, but if they've combined it and incorporated it into a new secondary data set and then that data set B becomes very popular, gets cited very frequently, then my original data set might miss out on some of that usage, some of those downloads, some of those records of engagement with that data set. So this is something where there are some theoretical frameworks for thinking through how systems on the back end can kind of track which data sets have gone into the production of secondary data sets to kind of pass some of that credit back to the original creators. But this is not something that, to my knowledge, has been implemented anywhere yet. And so it does remain a challenge for thinking about how authors can appropriately be credited for reuse of their data. So I did want to take a moment to also just show what some of these data repositories look like by highlighting some of the ones that do make use of those standardized reporting metrics, since those are the ones that are kind of best positioned for future technical developments and making sure that authors do get appropriate credit for the data that they produce. And to do this, I wanted to give just a quick tour of what a couple of data sets look like on these different repositories, since there are also a lot of decisions that you make as a researcher in where you choose to host your data. So Dryad is one that researchers have, I've worked with researchers in using frequently in the past, and one that I found authors to generally be satisfied with. So a data set on Dryad will typically include a list of files that can be downloaded individually or downloaded as a batch as a zip file. Dryad makes it easy to include a lot of that keyword information right up front, as well as information about any funding sources that you've received with that data set as well. One thing that's nice about Dryad too is that they require that at least one author include an ORCID ID, which you might have heard about in previous previous workshops in this series. But an ORCID ID as part of your profile as a researcher will make it easier to link various outputs that you've produced, not only articles and presentations, but data sets as well. And then Dryad also will include a handy list here of different related works to your data set, other things that have been cited, but you can also identify a primary article if it does support an individual, if it was in support of a specific publication. Another popular repository is Figshare. I find the interface for this one to be a little bit more confusing, but it is one that's rather popular because it makes it rather easy for researchers to be able to put up their data files in a fairly quick manner and get a DOI for them. And so Figshare will typically provide these files in a list at the top, which can work out well if you have a relatively small number of files, but can get kind of cumbersome if you have a longer list of files that you're working with instead. It allows for a lot of similar information to Dryad, such as keywords associated with your data set, and has those same usage metrics kind of put up top, front and center. But one warning to working with Dryad or with Figshare is that in a lot of cases, it has much less required information that you as an author include. Dryad will prompt you to include things such as an ORCID ID, which will help with the longevity of your data. But Figshare will allow you to publish data sets without including that, which means you might end up missing them. Mendeley data, I don't have as much to say about, but again, this uses that same counter code of practice for data set metrics and has an interface that is rather similar to Dryad as well. One thing that is useful about Mendeley data is that it allows you to include different folders for the data that you have. And so then you can go into a folder and then be able to see additional files associated that way. So if you do have an important folder structure to working with your data set, then Mendeley data would be one option for you to be able to work with that, work within that folder structure and preserve it for others to use. And then the last repository I wanted to highlight is Zenodo. It functions in much the same way as the others. It will provide typically a list of files here and then some good options for being able to add documentation there as well. It also interacts with ORCID IDs, so these can automatically be linked to your ORCID profiles. But one thing that makes Zenodo a little bit unique is that they offer an integration for working with GitHub. So if you are producing a lot of code or scripts in your research, then Zenodo would be an option for archiving your GitHub repository, kind of taking a snapshot of it at a specific moment, and then sharing it via this repository. So what's shared here is a Python library for being able to work with earth science data. This is a library that I believe these researchers have continued to develop at their GitHub repository, but sometimes it can be useful to make sure that you're archiving a specific version of that software that you've created so that if others go back and interact with any of your associated data, they have the version of that library that matches whatever it is you used at that time when you first produced it. So those are some quick looks at what data sets can look like on some of these different generalist repositories. I will note too, there are options for discipline-specific repositories as well. So if you're interested in one of those as a home for your data, that's something that I can help you identify too. So thus far, we've talked a lot about thinking about data set publication itself. So if you recall those repositories we just looked at, a lot of those provided direct access to the individual data files, whether that was software, whether that was tabular data stored in CSV files, things like that. Another option for boosting your data sets and getting credit for those is by writing what's known as a data paper. These data papers take more of the traditional manuscript route, but rather than writing about rather than writing up research findings, going through your methodology for a particular research process, and then analyzing and discussing those findings, a data paper is more meant to provide specific context for an individual data set in a manner that promotes others being able to reuse and work through it. Crucially, data papers typically do go through a peer review process. So if that's something that's important for your career advancement, then a data paper is a good way to make sure that you are getting that peer reviewed publication if it's something that you need. The format of a data paper will typically lay out relevant information for your data set. And that typically includes collection methods. So how did you generate this data? A description of the records that goes beyond what you might be able to just include in documentation included in that data set. Any technical validation that you underwent with your data, quality assurance to make sure that all the results there are valid, and how you caught or corrected any mistakes. And then finally, they also typically include considerations for reuse. There may be data sets that, from a formal perspective, may not include any personally identifiable information or data that is HIPAA protected, for example, but there may still be some ethical considerations that others should take into account around how they use that data. For example, perhaps not using it to pinpoint locations of endangered species or otherwise sensitive geographical information. And those considerations for reuse might go beyond ethics to other applications or other warnings as well that others should just take into account when they reuse your data. So a data paper is a good way of providing more of a narrative explanation, walking a reader through how you generated and worked with this data, which sometimes can be a little bit easier for others to read than just all of the documentation that you might produce. Um, you may find some discipline-specific journals that accept data papers as a submission type in addition to more traditional research articles. But another option for a place to publish these can be the Journal of Scientific Data, which is a journal of nature. It's specifically interdisciplinary and specializes in publishing these papers in particular. So they also have kind of the most formalized version for being able to go through or for being able to compare these data papers across disciplines as well. And here I just took a brief screenshot of some of the data sets or data papers that have recently been published on in the Journal of Scientific Data, which I wanted to show kind of just to give you a look at how broad the disciplinary nature of these can be and how broad the types of data sets that might be described in a data paper can be as well. So going back now to thinking about what you're doing when you're publishing the actual data set itself, how you are making that available to other people. There are a lot of data sets that may be published either simply because the author wants to, or because a funder requires it, that go and live on a data repository, but never really do get much use beyond that point. They frequently won't be cited. Maybe there aren't even a lot of people looking at or downloading that data set. And a big reason behind that is that not all shared or published data is actually usable data. And now we're going to talk some about what some of those barriers to reuse look like, and how you can avoid them to make sure that others are actually are actually able to interact with and work with your data. So there are a few different common barriers to reuse that might prevent someone from wanting to work with your data set. Um, the first and one of the most common is inscrutable file names. So if you go and you open if you've downloaded a zip file containing data for a particular project and you open it and there are 1,000 files in there and all of them simply have names that are just integers, for example, or just names like table 1, table 2, with no additional context there, and there's no way for you to easily be able to understand what those file names mean, then it's unlikely that you're going to work with that data if you aren't able to tell, for example, which data file corresponds to a particular research subject. Then if you can't produce good findings based on that data set, or can't be positive that you know that you have all the context you need there, then you're less likely to want to work with it. On a related aspect of context, looking at the actual level of an individual file itself, it's pretty common if you look at some of these data repositories to download and see data sets that have unexplained abbreviations in them. Maybe that would be an unexplained acronym, such as NSL in this case, or more commonly, you have data that is lacking units. So here, a variable name such as removed area might be kind of self-explanatory, but we have no information about what units are applied there. Are we talking centimeters squared, meters squared, acres, etc.? Oftentimes, you can locate that information in some supporting documentation, but in a regrettable number of occurrences, researchers forget to include that information and others can't understand that context. And then finally, less of a barrier, but one thing I just like to caution people about, if you are ever sharing code or related analysis for your data, make sure you review any comments that you had in there that may have been, inside jokes between your research team or otherwise something that worked within the context for that actively managed code, but you may not want to share as broadly with researchers in the same way. Or maybe you do. Sometimes it's nice to add that little bit of levity. It doesn't really harm your data set in any way, but it is just something to review when you think about who else might be working with your data. So data gets shared across a wide variety of disciplines, and while those issues such as file names or uninterpretable variables can be common elements across different disciplines. Another way for kind of thinking about and evaluating the quality of your data before you share it is thinking within the FAIR framework. FAIR stands for data that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and exists as a standard for being able to compare the quality of data sets across disciplines by providing some general principles that could be applied across a lot of different disciplines. Um, and so I wanted to share just one example of what each of those might correspond with in the context of sharing data that you want published and reused by others. So data that's findable would be shared in a repository that provides a persistent identifier, such as a DOI, a digital object identifier, and offers a standardized citation. That way, if another person sees your data set referenced in an article, they're able to access it very quickly without having to do a bunch of searching to maybe eventually come across your data set. Additionally, data that is accessible would not only be would not only be perfunctorily shared, but also would provide researchers with all of the context that they need to be able to work with that data set. So that would include any documentation that you've produced or any code necessary for analyzing or working with that data. A lot of times researchers will leave this out, and maybe it is possible to track them down for that information, but it's better to include it with the data set itself if possible. Uh, Third, Data should be interoperable by sharing it whenever possible in open and non-proprietary file formats that can be used across a variety of systems. So the most common example of this is if you are a researcher who does a lot of work with Excel files, consider converting those to CSV, comma-separated variable files, before you share your data, because CSVs will be more easily usable by other systems, whether SPSS, R, Python, than an Excel file. So that can save a bit, it can lower a barrier for researchers who want to work with your data. And then finally, data is reusable if it includes that robust documentation I mentioned earlier, so that others can easily and quickly tell if it fits whatever their purpose is, whether that's combining multiple data sets for a meta-analysis or looking for a particular exemplar data set that they can reanalyze in a new context. Um, and now I wanted to provide some quick examples of what data set documentation can look like. These are just some quick hits of things that I talk about in other contexts too. So if you're an instructor and want to talk about more of this with your students, that's something I'm here to help with. Or if you just want to talk more about what these look like in the context of your own research, I'm happy to do that in a consult as well. So one of the simplest things that you can do is apply a file naming convention to your data set, especially if it is comprised of a lot of different files. A file naming convention at its core is just a set of structured and consistently applied rules to your data files so that others and sometimes machines and computer programs as well can easily tell at a glance what file corresponds to a particular part of that data set. So for example, this is a quick example of how we might use a file naming convention, maybe for survey data collected at different school districts in Lexington. We can include information like the date of data collection, the city where that data is collected, and then a name for the district as well. That way, if we're collecting maybe dozens or hundreds of different surveys across different dates, across different cities, or across different school districts, we would have all that information right in the file name and be able to compare that easily and sort the data easily there as well. Thinking about how you can better clear up information within an individual file, maybe let's think about a tabular data file here, you can consider creating a data dictionary for the variables that are included in your data set. A data dictionary is usually a table itself that provides additional context for the variables that you're working with. So you might have information such as an easy human readable name for that data, for that variable, the name of the variable as it appears in your data set, any information about the measurements that are applied and units that are applied to that data set, an acceptable range of values for what should be read there, and then another human readable description to provide a little bit more of that context. These are especially crucial if you've done any recoding of your data. Maybe you have integers that correspond to values on a Likert scale, for example. A data dictionary would be a place where you could provide that additional context. And then finally, zooming back out to your data set as a whole, you can consider providing a README file as a way of providing a human readable, high level overview of the entire collection of files that comprise a data set. README files take different forms, but these will typically include a description of the different subfolders included within a data set, along with some methodological information about the data as well, so that others have the necessary context that they need to be able to work with it. A lot of that documentation and methodology typically will be included kind of on that record page on a data repository as well. But it is good practice to include that in a README file so that the person who downloads that data set always has direct access to that documentation, even if they've lost track of that original record page for it. This is also a good spot to include any citation information so that you can direct users back to that original source if necessary. I provide on a guide that I have to research data management templates for being able to work with all of these different types of documentation, which you're welcome to access. But these are also things that I work with researchers on individually as well. So if you want tips on more specific tips on getting started with these, I can provide that assistance too. Oops. So I wanted now to just address a couple of different things to consider before you put your data out there and make it available to others to use. Obviously, that's something that I'm very much in support of and really do encourage researchers to do whenever it's appropriate. But there are some things that you need to take into account to make sure that others are able to reuse your data and do it in a fashion that's appropriate. One of those elements to boosting reuse of your data is making sure that you apply a copyright license to your data set that best matches the way you want others to be able to use it. These can get more complicated, but I wanted to address here just two common versions of this that you see on repositories and just what they mean. One of the most common is a CC BY license, which indicates to others that they're free to copy, adapt, reuse, remix your data set, or any other type of material that you've licensed in this way, provided that they give you proper attribution before they do so. Um, so you're essentially saying others are allowed to create a new data set based on the data set that you have, conduct a new analysis there, but they just need to make sure that they cite you as the original creator of that data set. Another option is known as a CC0 waiver, which indicates that you reserve no rights to the material that you've produced and let others reuse it without any sort of restriction. Some people sometimes refer to a CC0 waiver as putting something in the public domain. That's a little bit distinct in that you as an individual are saying that you're reserving no rights to the material. If, for example, you did use copyrighted material in the production of that data set, else might still have a claim to it. But you are just saying with this CC0 waiver that to the extent that you have any claim over that data set, you're waiving it and allowing others to reuse it in whatever fashion possible. Um, a lot of researchers do prefer using a CC BY license because they want to make sure that they're getting publication credit for that data set. If others do use it, making sure that they do get that proper attribution. Um, but I would encourage you to consider if it's appropriate for your data to consider a CC0 waiver, largely because they help avoid a problem known as attribution stacking. Essentially, if a researcher maybe produces dataset B and licenses it under a CC BY license, then someone else produces dataset C, and each one is including one of these CC BY licenses. Those can get really daunting for a researcher to keep track of in making sure that they're doing their due diligence and giving appropriate attribution to everyone throughout that chain, which is something that you might want to do if you are concerned about making sure you keep that attribution. But in a lot of cases, a CC0 waiver helps avoid some of that fear of legal risk and then makes researchers feel better about reusing that data set. I'll also mention when you issue something under a CC0 waiver, the standards of the ethics of your discipline still apply. If I produce a data set and bequeath it to others to use however they want, and someone else tries to pass that off as their original data that they've collected themselves, they've still engaged in fraud in that case. I would still have a claim within the ethics of research to make against that person for not giving me proper credit or attribution or trying to pass off my work as their own. So CC0 does not mean that you're giving up any right to be able to sort of pursue those types of claims. It just means that they would take place under the banner of research ethics rather than within this framework of copyright instead. Another important consideration is making sure that participants have given appropriate consent for their data to be shared and used by others in this way. So there's a guide that the NIH provides to inform consent for secondary research with data and biospecimens, which is quite helpful regardless of what discipline you're in, because it provides sample language that can apply to a lot of different information that might be collected from human participants. This is really important because maybe you're considering publishing a past data set that you've collected and maybe still have access to. Make sure you review the informed consent language if human participants were involved there. If you explicitly state, for example, that you will maintain access to that data, but not share it with others, then you would not be able to publish that data because the participants did not appropriately consent to be able to have their data shared, even in a de-identified form. So make sure you review that for any past data you may be looking at, and examine and make sure any future language you use is appropriate for for participants to be able to know how their data will be shared, even if it is in de-identified form. So I wanted to close with a couple thoughts on how, focusing on this theme of Research Impact Week, how you can best make sure that the data that you have is supporting your own impact as a researcher. The most obvious way to do so is to make use of some of those standardized metrics that are provided by some of those data repositories. These are primarily views, downloads, and citations, although do keep in mind of some of those issues I mentioned previously with citation linkages. If you're aware that your data set has been cited elsewhere, but it's not showing up on that record for your data set, then try contacting the repository. In a lot of cases, they will be willing to add it, which is great. And also try contextualizing some of those numbers within what they look like for other data sets shared within your discipline if possible. Data sharing and reuse of data really is just a lot more common in certain disciplines than it is in others. So numbers that may feel low to you just at a glance may actually be quite impactful by the standard of other data sets in your discipline. In addition to that quantitative information, think about some of the qualitative aspects of your data set as well. So if you're aware that your data set is being used in ways other than a peer-reviewed citing article, then that's something that you might have opportunity to describe in your promotion materials or in other aspects of your career advancement. So for example, if a researcher contacts you and lets you know that they really like your data set and they're using it as a teaching resource, that's something that you can highlight. Additionally, you can make some of this labor to make your data set reusable visible when you highlight and describe some of the steps that you took to make your data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which will make it clear to your peers and to other decision makers what work went into that. And then emphasize the role that your data sharing played in improving the rigor of your associated articles and other research outputs that you might have. Um, some researchers feel, and I'm very sympathetic to this, that sharing data can kind of be increasing a certain degree of exposure you have. Maybe you're worried that your findings themselves are sound, but someone has questions about the data set that you've produced. And maybe you're kind of increasing the surface on which they could sort of poke holes in the research that you've produced. And so emphasize those steps that you took to and emphasize the role that data sharing plays in improving the credibility and research rigor of what it is that you produce. And then just again, while there may be qualitative aspects to sort of write this up narratively, a data paper can also be a way to highlight a lot of this information as well in a peer-reviewed aspect that may be more legible to your peers in your department. I'll also just note for anyone who is really interested in this idea of data publication and some of those problems that I mentioned around things like citation, you might consider contributing to bibliometric research on data citation practices within your discipline. While there are some researchers who have looked at what data citation looks like writ large across the research environment as a whole, there's a lot less work when it comes to quantitative and discipline-specific research on data citation practices in individual fields. A big reason for this is because while there are, for example, things like keyword subjects for different data sets, it can be difficult to sort of establish a data set corpus for an individual field of research or a particular discipline. And that's an area where all of you as subject experts really would have a big role to play in helping researchers think through how you can establish the boundaries of that type of field. If you want to explore this more or are interested in getting started, the data citation corpus, which is produced by DataCite and the Make Data Count initiative, includes more than 10 million records of data set and research article publication pairs. And it does do some work in trying to impute the subject of some of those data sets, but it's not perfect. And that's a good place to sort of start checking to see if you would be able to provide some of that more specific subject information or some of that keyword information as well to look at what data sharing, data citation looks like within disciplines and where it could be improved. And then the last note I'll close on is if you are in a role as a decision maker for thinking about how others are evaluated based on their scholarship, one thing that you can consider is roles you could play in boosting the importance of data publishing in your field by improving incentives there. One of the biggest barriers to data publishing or data sharing is researchers simply don't have time for it, and they aren't willing to prioritize it when they have a lot of other things that they do need to prioritize that they know they're going to be evaluated on when they go up for promotion or tenure or when they're looking for a new position, that kind of thing. And so if you are someone who is in this kind of role and based on anything in this presentation are interested in being able to consider how you could incentivize some of researchers to think more about data publishing as first-class research outputs, then this article here from the journal PLOS gives some different rules for how more additional credit can be given for the development of data and software in the hiring, promotion, and tenure process for research scientists. So thank you all very much for your time today. Hopefully this has given you a new lens of thinking about data publishing as its own form of research, and given you some thought to some of the ways that you can make sure that you're getting appropriate credit there to boost your impact and profile as a researcher. So thank you all very much for your time and attention today. And we'll be sticking around for questions. So feel free to come on mic if you'd like to ask them, or just put them in the chat if you'd prefer. And just in case anyone came in late, I'm also putting in another link to the slides as well. And Annabelle just included a link to a feedback form as well. So please do fill that out.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you mentioned like one of the fears of people who might make their data available for others to see is that people could kind of poke holes in the data itself. I'm wondering on the other side of that, is there any kind of like best practices for quality appraisal of the data itself out there right now?
There are some standards for data curation for that process of kind of preparing a data set before it's shared by others. That's a role that I play for researchers at UK as well. So if you want someone to be able to review your data set before it's published, that's a role that I can play too. Though those data curation elements typically focus on high-level aspects of usability. So we as data curators will look at things like the way that files are named, making sure that, for example, if you've got spreadsheet data, making sure that everything in that is actually a neat table and there aren't, extraneous notes or unexplained cells off somewhere else. So that level of just human review by an outsider can be very helpful in terms of providing some of that quality assurance there. There are also standards like Hadley Wickham's concept of tidy data for thinking about data set records in neat rows where each observation corresponds to a single row that can apply across disciplines as well. But of course, there are always going to be additional standards that might apply within an individual discipline. The ones that have the most developed ones are typically the ones where data sharing is most common already. So for example, I don't do a lot of work with like genetics data, for example, but there are some more standards that are in place for being able to standardize how some of that data is formatted to improve interoperability. And then I'll also mention that if you do any research for the NIH has a common data element CDE project trying to standardize some of these variables across different studies, again, thinking towards being able to combine some of those together. So all of those are things that focus really on that idea of interoperability for improving the way that um, to make it easier for others to work with your data, which really can boost the way that it gets used. But really the main standard and one where the specifics might differ from discipline to discipline is interpretability of your data set. Would someone be able to look at this, use it, and reproduce any associated findings in your publication, for example?
Great, thank you.
All right, if there are any additional questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put those in the chat. And if not, you're free to go. And thank you so much for joining our presentation today. We really appreciate it. But yeah, if there are any more questions, feel free to unmute or put yourself in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you all.